Emily Grace wasn't the kind of woman anyone remembered in town. 34, weathered from mountain air and harder years, she made her way through each day with her chin down and her hands calloused. She lived in a rented shack tucked behind a dying gas station on the edge of Knoxville, Tennessee, and worked nights as a dishwasher in a bar that barely kept its lights on. She hadn't spoken to anyone in her family in over a decade, which is why the letter stopped her cold. It came in a yellowed envelope with no return address, no fancy seal, just her name, scrawled in trembling ink. Emily Grace Box, 17, Valley Post Office, Tennessee. She opened it right there at the post office counter, still smelling faintly of coffee and fryer grease from her shift. Inside was a legal document, half wrinkled, half surreal. Her great-aunt Ruth Garrison, whom she'd only heard about once from her mother in a passing memory, had left her a property in rural Montana. A cabin. No strings, no expectations. Just a key taped to the corner of the paper and a short, handwritten note at the bottom. She had no one left. I think she would have liked you. Emily read it 3 times. The lawyer's address was local to a town called Bonner's Ridge, Montana, a place she'd never heard of. She stuffed the letter in her coat pocket and walked home in a fog. The whole thing felt like a prank from a cruel god until she found herself staring at her open suitcase an hour later, holding up the key again. Old brass, stained at the edges. Real. She called in a final resignation the next morning. No one asked questions. No one cared. She sold what little she had, her space heater, a spare coat, the old Beta microwave, bought a bus ticket as far as it would take her west, then another. The trip took 4 days and ended in a town with more pine trees than people, where the air smelled like ash and old stories. The lawyer, a quiet man named Gregson, met her at the courthouse. He handed over the deed and gave her a look that hovered between pity and curiosity. She was a recluse, he said, not unkindly. No one really knew what she was doing out there. Lived off the grid, mostly. Some folks say she had mining rights, but nothing ever came of it. Emily asked what happened to Ruth. Gregson just shook his head. No one knows for sure. One day she stopped coming to town. Sheriff found the cabin locked. Empty. No sign of her. That was 7 years ago. 7 years. Emily felt a flicker of something ancient stir in her stomach. He handed her a faded map, pointed out the gravel road that would lead her there, and said something that stuck in her ears long after. If you find anything strange, just know this land's got layers. And not all of them like being uncovered. The drive was long. The rental car groaned on every incline. Dirt turned to gravel. Gravel turned to mud. The map ended before the road did. By dusk she found the cabin. It was barely standing. Weather-warped logs, roof half-caved, porch leaning like it had arthritis. A broken wind chime clinked weakly in the breeze. And there, sitting at the edge of the steps, was a dog. Large, still, watching. At first she thought he was part of the furniture. He didn't move, didn't bark, didn't growl, just watched her with those burnt amber eyes. "Hey," she whispered. The dog blinked. He was dirty, fur-matted, ribs visible beneath his coat. A long scar ran down his side. He looked ancient, broken. "Do you belong to someone?" Still nothing. But he didn't leave. Emily stepped onto the porch. The dog flinched, then stood up slowly, too slowly for a dog his size. His paws clicked against the old wood. He sniffed the air once, then sat again, tail curled tight. Inside, the cabin smelled of dust and memory. Furniture covered in blankets, a fireplace full of ash, rusted pots, and in the far corner, a tattered cot with a frayed quilt still folded at the foot. No photos, no notes, nothing human, except the dog. Emily unpacked what little she had. Some canned food, a flashlight, an old flannel coat, and laid it all on the table. When she turned around, the dog was inside, quiet as fog. He lay near the fireplace, head on his paws, eyes watching her every move. Something about the way he looked at her made her stomach knot. That night, it snowed. Emily lit a fire, curled into the quilt, and tried to sleep. Around midnight, the dog whined, a low, pitiful sound that didn't match his size. She sat up. He was standing now, staring at the front door. "You want out?" He didn't move. Emily opened the door. The wind bit at her cheeks. The dog stepped forward, paused, then looked back. "Okay," she said, pulling on her boots. "I'm coming with you." They walked into the woods. The trees moaned in the wind. The snow creaked beneath their feet. The dog led the way, slow but purposeful. 10 minutes in, he stopped. There, under a half-fallen pine, was a pile of rocks, neatly arranged, like someone had stacked them, not recent, not natural. The dog pawed at them once, then sat. Emily stared, heart pounding, and though she didn't know why, she whispered, "Is this where it starts?" The dog looked up at her, not wagging, not panting, just waiting. She shivered. Something was buried here, and it wasn't just in the dirt. The wind had teeth that day. Emily stood just outside the warped doorway, hand on the splintered frame, watching the old dog settle back onto the porch, as if he belonged there. Maybe he did. Maybe he'd never left. She didn't know how long he'd been waiting, or for whom, but he looked like someone who had outlived more than one good reason to stay. Inside the cabin, the smell was a mix of mildew and pine, faded memories soaked into the walls. She opened each window one by one, letting light bleed across the dusty floors. The silence inside was thick an absence that pressed into her ribs. The dog didn't follow her in this time. He lay curled beneath the front window, his eyes half closed, ears still twitching at every sound. She watched him for a moment through the crack in the window frame, then returned to the back room, where she found a pile of half-burnt notebooks in a rusted tin box. Most were illegible, eaten by moisture and time, but a few had legible phrases. "The maps aren't accurate." He knew, I'm sure of it. Weston was here again. No names, no full context. But her heart ticked faster. That night, the temperature dropped fast. Emily cooked a dented can of beans over a tiny camp stove. The fireplace was useless, too clogged with soot to breathe. She placed a bowl of water near the doorway and called out gently, "Hey, you hungry?" The dog didn't move. But 20 minutes later, when she was curled on the mattress of bundled towels and fleece, she heard slow, deliberate steps on the wood. Then the sound of lapping. She peeked. He was drinking, tongue moving lazily, eyes scanning the room as if expecting danger even in this silence. She sat up. "I should give you a name," she whispered. The dog stopped, turned and looked at her. There was something in his gaze, not curiosity, not fear, recognition. "Hank," she said softly. "You look like a Hank." He didn't object, just lay down near the hearth, his back turned, but not dismissive, resigned. In the days that followed, they established a rhythm. Emily cleared out the mouldy bedding. She fixed a leaky corner of the roof with garbage bags and duct tape. She hung wind chimes made of bottle caps and wire, not because they were pretty, but because the silence needed something to break it. Hank stayed. He never barked, never growled, never begged. He would vanish into the trees some mornings, return before dusk. He always walked the perimeter before lying down on the porch like a sentinel watching over a kingdom no one remembered. One morning, she found a dead squirrel laid neatly at the cabin steps. A gift. The next day, it was a rabbit. She looked at Hank. He didn't wag his tail or puff his chest. He just sat there, tired eyes locked on hers, as if to say, "This is what I can offer." It's not much, but it's yours. Emily buried the rabbit, cooked the squirrel. That night, as they sat outside, the stars cracked open above the trees. She leaned against the post of the porch, hands wrapped around a mug of instant coffee, and said it out loud. "I think this place killed her." Hank didn't move. She was trying to tell someone something. "I don't know what yet, but I feel it, like it's under the floorboards or behind the trees or stitched into the wallpaper." The dog shifted, not startled, not scared, just alert. Emily narrowed her eyes. "You know, don't you?" The dog rose slowly and disappeared into the trees. She waited an hour before going back inside. The next morning, there were scratches on the back door. Deep, deliberate ones. Not random, not frantic. A pattern. She crouched, fingers brushing the grooves. 3 vertical lines, a space, then 1 diagonal slash across all 3. It wasn't an accident. Later that afternoon, she walked to the edge of the property line, guided by the map Gregson had given her. But something felt wrong. The terrain didn't match. The river marked on the map didn't exist anymore. A rock formation that should have been north was sitting south. Back at the cabin, she compared it to the map again, and frowned. Ruth had written something in the margins, barely visible under the smudge of mold. They rotated the map. Emily turned it sideways, then upside down. It changed everything. Hank, from his spot on the porch, let out a low growl. Not at her, at the woods. She turned fast. Nothing. But she felt it too. Something off, just beyond the tree line. That night, she locked the door. She had never locked the door before. Hank lay inside, just by the foot of the cot. In the middle of the night, she woke to the sound of a low, deliberate growl. Hank was on his feet, facing the window, every muscle taut, ears forward. Emily grabbed her flashlight. The beam sliced through the dark, landed on shadows shifting between the trees. She stepped out onto the porch barefoot, heart pounding. A figure stood just at the edge of the clearing. Watching. When the light hit him, he moved casually, like he belonged there. But Emily knew every soul within 5 miles of the cabin by now. That man wasn't one of them. "Hank," she whispered. The dog took 1 step forward, his body between her and the figure. The man vanished back into the woods. Emily didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, Hank was gone. He didn't return by midday. Not by dusk. Emily stood on the porch, scanning the tree line, fear settling in her gut like ice. She called out once, twice. Then, just before the sun dipped behind the ridge, he emerged, blood on his flank. A torn piece of blue flannel caught in his teeth. Emily rushed down the steps, panic flooding her throat. What happened? She crouched, hands shaking as she checked the gash. It wasn't deep, but it was fresh. Clean, like it had come from a blade. And the fabric, she recognized it. It matched the shirt worn by the man at the edge of the woods. Hank dropped it at her feet, then sat down, calm, solid. And for the first time, she realized. He wasn't just a stray. He was guarding something. Not the cabin. The hardest part wasn't the loneliness. Emily had made peace with that long ago. It was the silence, the kind that lingered in the rafters, crept up your spine, and made you question whether the walls were holding secrets or just holding their breath. The cabin groaned constantly, as if it was trying to speak, but didn't remember how. When the wind blew hard enough, the windows cried. The floor shifted beneath her steps. Nothing felt solid. She threw herself into repairs, patching up what little she could with found wood, salvaged nails, and stubborn resolve. She kept her hands busy to keep her mind from drifting. Days bled together like the ink stains on Ruth's old notebooks. Weather reports were useless. Storms came unannounced and lingered like uninvited ghosts. The people in town offered no warmth either. Bonner's Ridge was a place that smiled only when it was certain you weren't staying. And Emily had stayed. At the hardware store, the woman at the counter avoided eye contact when Emily asked about roofing tar. An older man near the seed aisle muttered loud enough for her to hear, "Crazy lady living up in Ruth's bones. With that dog." She tried to ignore it, but whispers grew roots in a small town. They thought she was a squatter, or worse, some drifter looking to claim land with no rightful claim. There were rumors about Ruth's disappearance. Theories. Some said she'd gone mad and wandered into the woods. Others hinted at foul play, but no one had cared enough to look for answers. Until Emily arrived. And now that she was here, they didn't want her digging up ghosts. She asked the post office clerk once if anyone had ever looked into Ruth's case. The woman, without lifting her eyes from the scale, said, "Some folks disappear on purpose. Others should have." That was the last time Emily went into town that week. Back at the cabin, Hank remained her only constant. Loyal but distant, like a soldier on permanent patrol. He didn't beg for food, didn't bark at noises, didn't even flinch at thunder. His silence wasn't just quiet, it was hollow, like something inside him had been turned off and buried deep. Emily often wondered if he was broken, or if he'd just seen too much. She tried to coax him into play once, tossing a stick gently in the yard. He didn't move. She sat beside him that evening, the air heavy with pine and early frost. "You ever bark, Hank?" she asked, voice soft. He blinked. Nothing more. That night, Emily dreamed of water deep, black, endless. She was sinking. Ruth was there, standing just above the surface, whispering something Emily couldn't hear. And Hank, he was swimming away. She woke covered in sweat, the fire nearly out, the shadows stretching longer than they should. A scraping sound pulled her out of bed. She held her breath. Again, scraping, slow, rhythmic. It was coming from the front door. She crept toward it, heart ticking fast. Hank wasn't in his usual spot. She froze. Another scrape. Then a soft thud. She opened the door a crack. Hank stood there, paw pressed to the wood, breathing hard. Not from exertion, this was something else. Alertness, urgency. He looked up at her, eyes sharp for the first time since she'd met him. Then he stepped back. Emily hesitated, fingers tightening around the doorknob. "You want to go out there?" she whispered. He looked over his shoulder towards the trees, then back at her. She didn't grab a coat, just boots and a flashlight. Hank didn't wait. He moved fast for an old dog through the clearing, past the shed, and into the woods that bordered the property. The flashlight caught glimpses of him between the trees, golden eyes reflecting like twin lanterns. 15 minutes in, the ground began to slope. Emily was panting. The cold air stabbed her lungs. Hank moved with purpose, not once checking if she was keeping up. Then he stopped. They stood in a hollow where the trees grew dense and the moon barely touched the ground. A fallen pine lay across a dry creek bed. Hank paced along it, sniffing, then dug his paws into the soil beside the trunk. He stopped, waited. Emily caught up, flashlight beam jittering across leaves. At his feet was something out of place. A flat, square patch of earth. The soil here had been disturbed recently. She knelt, brushing away layers of pine needles. Her fingers struck metal. A latch. Emily blinked. Cleared more dirt. There was a hatch door buried beneath the earth. "What the hell?" she muttered. Hank didn't move. His body blocked her from the trees, from whatever might be watching. Emily's hand trembled as she lifted the rusted latch. It creaked like a scream. Below, darkness yawned open. A ladder led into a narrow shaft lined with rotting boards. She couldn't see the bottom. She turned to Hank. "You knew this was here." He didn't respond. just stared into the hole, and for the first time she saw something flicker in his eyes. Not warning, memory. Emily stood, breath visible in the cold, and whispered, "Is this where she went?" Hank turned slowly, padded to her side, and sat. The silence roared between them. Something had been hidden here, buried and forgotten. But Hank hadn't forgotten. He had waited for someone to come back. And now, he had chosen her. 2 days passed before Hank led her there. It started in the morning, after breakfast. Emily had just poured water into Hank's bowl when he stood abruptly and walked to the door. Not like before, not a casual patrol, not a stretch-his-legs walk, but decisive. He looked back at her, sharp and insistent. "You found something," she murmured. She grabbed her coat, a small crowbar, and a flashlight, then followed him past the tree line, down the slope behind the cabin, deeper into the pines than she'd ever gone. The forest changed as they moved. Thicker air, denser undergrowth, shadows that didn't belong to trees. Hank weaved through a tangle of roots and disappeared around a moss-covered boulder. When she caught up, her breath snagged. The ground had collapsed near an old, gnarled tree. Its roots jutted out like broken fingers. At the base, a stack of cut logs had been arranged carefully. Too carefully. Emily dropped to one knee and touched the wood. Dry. Old, but untouched by weather. Hank sat silently beside her, tail still, eyes locked on the buried spot. "You knew this was here," she said under her breath. She began pulling away the logs. Beneath them was packed soil, then a layer of slate tiles, one cracked clean down the center. Underneath that, a rusted metal box, heavy and stained with time. Her hands trembled as she lifted it out. It wasn't locked. Inside were documents, rolled maps, photographs, folded papers with water damage around the edges. A scent of oil, earth, and something older wafted out. She unrolled the first page. A hand-drawn topographic map. Her cabin at the center. But there were markings she hadn't seen before. Shaded areas labeled with old mining codes, arrows, dotted paths. The next paper was a ledger, entries for mineral yields, dates back to 1974. Emily's eyes narrowed as she flipped through. A name caught her breath. Ruth Garrison, handwritten in a neat, slanted script on the title line of a legal filing. She kept reading. Deed transfer drafts, correspondence, letters addressed to an attorney in Missoula, none mailed. One photograph, faded and creased, showed a young Ruth standing beside a rock face, pickaxe in hand, smiling like she knew something no one else did. At the bottom of the box was a sealed envelope labeled "To be opened only if." The rest had smudged beyond recognition. Emily packed everything carefully and stood. Hank was watching her, unmoving. "We need to find someone who can read all of this," she said. That afternoon, she drove into Bonner's Ridge, maps and documents tucked in her satchel. Every bump in the road felt like it might tear the truth apart. The town's municipal office sat between a barber shop and a long-dead theater, its windows sun-bleached and streaked with dust. Mayor Thomas Weston wasn't expecting her. She introduced herself in the most neutral way she could. His eyes lingered too long. "Ruth's niece?" "Her great-niece, technically." He gestured for her to sit, but didn't offer coffee or warmth. His office was lined with antique mining photos and dusty trophies that seemed to exist only to remember a version of the town that no longer did. Emily pulled out the documents and spread them carefully on the table between them. "I found these buried behind the property," she said. "They belonged to Ruth. They reference a claim, possibly mineral rights. This map doesn't match any current zoning data I've seen." Weston didn't lean forward, didn't even glance at the papers. Instead, he smiled. It was the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. That land's been sold, Miss Grace. Emily's fingers tightened on the edge of the map. Sold? By who? There was a foreclosure years ago. Public record. No one notified the family. There was no family. At least not then. It sat unclaimed, tax delinquent for years. A development group bought it for reforestation. What you're living on isn't even technically yours. He finally looked at the map, then at her. You'd be wise to let sleeping dogs lie. There was something beneath his voice. Not threat, not even warning, control. Then why was the cabin still locked up tight? She asked. Weston's smile didn't waver. Not everything gets updated fast around here. Small towns are like that. And Ruth, she was eccentric. Didn't trust paper trails, Emily leaned forward, pushing the photograph towards him. Then how do you explain this? She documented something real. She was onto something. She was paranoid. Had been since the early 2000s. Everyone knew it. She kept to herself for a reason. She disappeared. He folded his hands. No proof of foul play. No body. Just a woman with secrets and time on her hands. Emily stood. He didn't stop her. Just added one more line, soft and quiet, as she reached the door. You have nothing here, girl. And you'd better forget what you saw. She left the office, heart pounding, hands cold. Back in the car, she stared at the envelope again. To be opened only if. She hadn't opened it yet. Somehow she knew she wasn't ready. That night, back at the cabin, she hung the maps on the wall, weighed down by nails and hope. She pinned the photograph above the fireplace. The wind howled. She heard it again, scratching, but this time not at the door. Inside. She turned, flashlight beam cutting across the cabin. Hank stood facing the far wall. His paw was raised. 4 fresh scratches marked the wood right beneath the photo of Ruth. Not random, parallel, deliberate, and directly aligned with a faint seam in the wall that Emily hadn't seen before. She looked at Hank. He met her gaze with something ancient, heavy. Whatever this cabin held, it hadn't finished speaking yet. And neither had he. Emily sat at the kitchen table. Maps and documents sprawled across the surface like a battlefield. The fireplace behind her hissed and popped, but the warmth couldn't touch the chill spreading inside her. Hank lay near the door, unmoving, watching her with a steady gaze that had begun to feel less like companionship and more like partnership. She was in over her head. That much was clear. But something in her, maybe the same stubborn grit that had driven Ruth, refused to back down. She needed help. The next morning, she drove back into Bonner's Ridge. Not to the mayor's office, not to the sheriff. She drove to the edge of town where a crooked sign read, J. Tobias Carpentry. The workshop behind it looked more like a tool graveyard than a functioning business. But Jonas Tobias, a weathered man in his 60s with a crooked back and hands like old leather, was still sharp. Former Army Corps of Engineers, used to know Ruth. And more importantly, didn't owe Weston a damn thing. Jonas didn't smile when he saw her. He just raised a brow and grunted, Thought you'd left. Can I show you something? She asked. She spread the documents across his bench. His eyes narrowed as he scanned the yellowed paper, tracing a finger along the map, then flipping over the mineral ledgers. He paused at the envelope marked to be opened only if. You open this yet? He asked. She shook her head. I figured if I opened it too early, I'd miss what it was meant to reveal. Jonas tapped the ledger. These entries are real, but they're not in the county registry. What does that mean? Means someone either buried them intentionally or never filed them. He stepped away and rummaged through a stack of books, pulling down a dusty binder of property claims. Pages flipped quickly under his calloused fingers until he stopped at one section. "This is the record for Parcel 9B, he said. "That's your land. Or Ruth's, rather." He turned it toward her. "See this line?" Emily leaned in. The name Garrison was there, followed by status, claim maintained. No legal transfer, no recorded sale. Jonas looked up at her. "There's no record of this land ever changing hands." "But Weston said—" Jonas snorted. "Weston says a lot of things. Most of them are only true if nobody checks." She leaned back, heart thudding. "So the foreclosure was a lie? Or never filed?" "Either way, it's not legal." She sat still, letting the pieces slide into place. Jonas stared at her, then added, "You think he did something to her?" "I think Ruth found something worth keeping secret. And I think Weston wanted it." Jonas looked down at Hank, who had quietly entered the shop and sat near the door, still and alert. "Hell of a dog," Jonas murmured. Emily nodded. He found the box. Led me to it. "You ever ask why he stayed out there all these years?" "I think he was waiting." Jonas said nothing, just pulled out his phone and snapped a picture of the map. "You keep the originals. I'll run this by a friend in Missoula." Quietly, she stood to leave, but he held up a hand. "Emily, if Weston finds out you're digging, be careful. He's not the type to forgive curiosity." Back at the cabin, Emily could barely sit still. She taped the map back on the wall, aligned it with the new notes Jonas had given her. If she was right, Ruth had discovered an unclaimed vein, possibly gold, beneath the old mining grid. Something worth hiding. Something worth killing for? That night, she opened the envelope. Inside was a letter, handwritten in clean cursive. "Emily, if you're reading this, I didn't make it back. That's not melodrama, that's preparation. I was followed. I know who it is, and if I'm right, this letter may never leave the cabin. They can't know what's beneath the ridge. It's not just minerals, it's leverage, it's history. You'll have to be smarter than me, and quieter. Trust the dog. His name is Hank. He knows more than he can tell you. Love." Ruth Emily dropped the letter, chest tightening. She looked at Hank, who hadn't moved. She moved to him, dropped to her knees, and pressed her forehead against his. "You stayed. You waited. You knew." Hank closed his eyes. In that moment, she heard a truck. Headlights flashed through the trees. Gravel crunched outside. Emily scrambled to the window and peered through the slit in the curtain. A white pickup. Official seal on the side. Sheriff's office. She didn't call anyone. There was a knock. Firm. No nonsense. She opened the door halfway. Sheriff Dillon stood on the porch, hands on his belt, eyes unreadable. "Got a report someone's been trespassing on protected land," he said flatly. "Trespassing?" she echoed. "Mayor Weston says you've been digging. Claims you're disrupting protected ground." Emily forced her voice steady. "This is private land." "I have the deed." He didn't blink. "Mind if I come in?" "I do." Dillon's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile. "You find anything, Miss Grace?" "Just a rusted cabin and a loyal dog." He stepped back. "Well, be careful. These woods can be unpredictable." She watched him walk back to his truck. As the engine roared to life, Hank growled low in his throat. Emily closed the door and bolted it. She turned to the maps. They'd set the trap. Now they just had to wait for someone to walk into it. The snow came fast that morning, early and heavy, cloaking the forest in silence. Emily stood at the window, watching the pines disappear into white, her breath fogging the glass. Hank sat by the door, tail still, ears forward. He hadn't touched his food. She turned to him. "You want to go?" He didn't move. But when she opened the door, he stood up, walked past her, and stared at the tree line. Something was different this time. There was a finality in the way he moved. No hesitation, no backward glance. Emily grabbed her coat, gloves, and flashlight, then followed. They hiked north, deeper than ever before. Branches clawed at her arms, snow sank into her boots. Hank pressed forward, tireless, guided by instinct or memory, maybe both. After nearly 40 minutes, he stopped at the edge of a thicket. Snow clung to a ridge of rocks, and beneath them, a half-collapsed overhang jutted from the hillside like a wound in the mountain. Hank looked back. Emily hesitated, then dropped to her knees and began pulling aside brush and stone. The air was colder here, unnaturally so. The opening beneath the overhang was small, just wide enough to crawl through. She ducked in, flashlight beam slicing the dark. The cave opened up quickly, a hollow pocket beneath the mountain. The air smelled of damp earth and rusted metal, and something else, something sour. She stepped forward. That's when she saw it. A skeleton, partially covered by a collapsed coat. Dusty, decayed, cradled between two slabs of stone, like someone had tried to lay it to rest. The coat was threadbare but intact, and on the chest pocket, barely visible through grime and time, was a single embroidered name, Ruth Garrison. Emily dropped to her knees. Her lungs stopped working. Hank walked into the cave slowly, quietly, as if entering a church. He didn't go to her. He went to the coat. He sat beside it, curled his body against the faded fabric and laid his head down. Emily covered her mouth, tears rising before she could stop them. This wasn't just a discovery, it was a reunion. She crawled closer, heart pounding, eyes scanning every detail. On the ground near Ruth's remains was a small leather pouch, weathered but sealed. She opened it with shaking hands and pulled out a bundle of pages notes, more maps, and one folded document marked Confidential Survey Findings. She barely registered it. Her eyes fell instead on the metal glint around Hank's neck. He hadn't worn a collar before, but now, in the dim light, she could see it clearly. A dull brass tag, partially buried under his fur. She reached out gently, brushed the fur aside, and read the inscription. Property of Ruth. Her throat clenched. You were hers, she whispered. All this time. Hank didn't move. He hadn't been astray. He'd been left behind. Or worse, he'd seen what happened and stayed. Emily sat back against the cold wall of the cave, her breath shaky. The pieces snapped into place faster than she could process them. Ruth hadn't vanished. She'd been buried here, either by accident or by force. The cave was hidden, remote, covered enough that no one would ever find it without help. But Hank had known. He'd carried the memory all these years, returning to the site again and again, waiting for someone to come back and finish what Ruth had started. A sudden wind howled through the cave mouth. Snow blew inward in a fine mist. Emily shivered. She opened Ruth's final pouch and scanned the survey. It wasn't just about gold. There were mineral readings, unregistered deposits, rare earth metals, massive yields. If Ruth had gone public, she would have exposed the town's dirty zoning practices. Weston stood to lose everything. Emily looked at the bones again, then at Hank. She didn't just die out here, did she? She asked softly. Hank raised his head, met her eyes, and let out a low, guttural sound. Not a growl, not quite a whine. A warning. Emily tucked the survey back into her coat. She had enough now to raise questions in the right places, enough to challenge Weston's lies, maybe even enough to get justice. She reached forward, ran her fingers along the collar again. You waited, she said. 7 years. The silence in the cave thickened. You brought me here for a reason. As they left, Emily turned for one last look. The beam of her flashlight caught the wall behind Ruth's body-thin scratches, faded but clear. Symbols, a makeshift calendar, tally marks, dozens of them. Ruth had been alive in that cave for days, maybe weeks. dying slowly, alone, except for her dog. Back at the cabin, Emily placed the collar on the mantel. She didn't say a word. Hank lay at her feet, eyes closed, as if something in him had finally gone quiet. That night, she didn't dream of drowning. She dreamed of a fire, of Ruth sitting beside her with a map in her hand and Hank at their feet, whole again, proud. And in the distance, Justice, walking slowly through the snow. Emily stood in front of the cabin, the cold seeping into her bones despite the heavy flannel and wool. She had sent everything: photos of Ruth's remains, the survey documents, the deed records, and Ruth's letter to the regional forestry office 2 days ago. And now they were coming for her. Not the Forestry Service. Weston. The headlights appeared just after dusk, cutting through the trees like searchlights. 3 trucks rolled up the old path, engines growling low like something alive. The crunch of boots followed, heavy and deliberate, and then came Weston, flanked by 2 deputies and a man in a brown coat she didn't recognize. She stepped onto the porch, hands in plain sight. "You're trespassing," she said calmly. Weston smirked, stopping just shy of the steps. "You've got about 24 hours left before that little fantasy collapses. I gave you the courtesy of time, Miss Grace. You should have taken it. I sent everything," she said. "Ruth's death, the mineral rights, the cave, the collar. It's out of your hands now." He laughed quietly, but there was no humor in it. "You sent a pile of unverified junk to a bunch of underpaid bureaucrats who barely remember what jurisdiction means. That land's already earmarked. It's done." One of the deputies stepped forward, resting a hand on the butt of his holstered weapon. Emily didn't flinch. "I have the deed," she said. "I have the records." "You have nothing," Weston snapped. "Just a dog and some dirt." That was when Hank stepped forward. He emerged from the shadows behind her, fur bristling, body low. His eyes didn't blink, didn't waver. For a moment, he was no longer the quiet old soul sleeping beside the hearth. He was something ancient, watching, measuring. Weston hesitated. "Call your mutt off," one of the deputies growled. Emily didn't say a word. Hank walked down the steps slowly, claws clicking against the wood. He stopped 3 feet in front of Weston and stood his ground. The wind shifted. Then Hank let out a growl. It wasn't the half-hearted sound of an old dog protecting a scrap of food. It was deep, raw, a sound pulled from somewhere beneath years of silence, a voice long buried. And then he barked. Once, loud enough to shake snow from the trees, loud enough to stop everyone where they stood. The man in the brown coat flinched. One of the deputies took a step back. Jonas arrived seconds later, headlights spilling across the clearing, followed by 2 trucks from town. Out stepped Clara from the post office, Alan from the feed store, even old Bert, who hadn't left his cabin in 2 years. "What's going on here?" Jonas called, walking toward them. "This is private land," Weston said tightly. "They're interfering with an official investigation." Jonas laughed once. "You're not an investigator. You're a man who got caught." He stepped beside Emily. Clara and Alan followed. Jonas looked Weston in the eye. "We read the reports." She showed us everything. Ruth's signature, the maps. That survey has coordinates that match the old mining grid. You knew that land wasn't legally yours, and now it's coming apart. Weston's face turned red, but he said nothing. Alan folded his arms. "People around here aren't stupid. We've seen you run roughshod over this town long enough." Clara added, "We remember Ruth." She didn't vanish. You buried her with silence. The man in the brown coat leaned toward Weston and whispered something. Weston turned abruptly, face pinched, and walked back to his truck. "You'll regret this." he muttered as he passed Emily. Hank stepped once to the side, muscles tense. Weston didn't look at him. The trucks reversed down the hill without another word. Emily exhaled only when their lights disappeared into the trees. Jonas turned to her. "You're not alone now." She nodded, overwhelmed. "Thank you." Clara came forward, slipping a small paper bag into Emily's hand. "Fresh bread." "You'll need it." Alan handed her a folded newspaper. "Front page tomorrow. Forestry office launched a review. Don't let up." As the crowd dispersed, Emily looked down at Hank. He was sitting again, silent once more, as if the fire had returned to embers. She knelt beside him, pulled him close, and whispered, "That bark, you saved me." He closed his eyes, leaning into her hand. It wasn't just protection, it was testimony. After 7 years, he had finally spoken, and the mountains had listened. The morning after the standoff felt different. Not warmer, but lighter, as if the air itself had been waiting for someone to call the lies by their name. Emily sat at the cabin table. Ruth's final ledger spread before her like scripture. Jonas sat across from her, glasses low on his nose, reading every line twice. Hank lay between them, his head resting near Emily's boot, eyes closed but ears alert. The document had been tucked behind the old hearthstone, sealed in wax, untouched by time. It was Ruth's final safeguard. Inside, payment schedules, signed checks, hand-drawn valuation charts, correspondence with a mineral surveyor, and, at the very back, a notarized agreement to sell. Except the last page was blank. No buyer signature. Jonas tapped the empty line with one calloused finger. She never sold it. Emily nodded slowly. She intended to. Or at least, they wanted her to. She got cold feet, he murmured, or figured it out just in time. He leaned back and rubbed his temples. "You understand what this means?" Emily looked at Hank, then back at the ledger. She still owned the mine. Even when she died, Jonas nodded. "And since you're the legal heir, you own it now." She swallowed hard. "That makes me the sole holder of mineral rights for a section of land Weston claimed to have developed." "Exactly." By midday, they were on the road to Missoula. Jonas knew a woman named Carla Bishop at the regional land office. Used to serve in the Marines, didn't care much for local politics. Carla met them in a small office lined with old maps and coffee rings. She read through the ledger with the kind of quiet that made Emily more nervous than raised voices. "This is good," Carla finally said. "Very good." Emily exhaled. Carla flipped through the final pages. "But this will get messy. Weston's paperwork will collapse under scrutiny, but he's got fingers in a lot of pies." "I don't care how messy," Emily said. "I want it done right. You'll need to file a claim validation, a mineral rights assertion, and a request for audit of all commercial activity on the parcel. I'll walk it through personally." She looked up. "But if there's something here, something valuable, you need legal representation. You're sitting on something worth a hell of a lot more than memories." "How much more?" Emily asked. Carla raised an eyebrow. "Conservative estimate?" "That ridge alone has been valued off record at over $3 million. Jonas let out a low whistle. Emily just stared. The world tilted. Not because of the money, but because Ruth had known. She'd tried to protect it, and Weston had done everything to bury her with it. "You file that paperwork," Carla said, "and I'll make sure it's visible to every federal eye that needs to see it." Back at the cabin that evening, snow fell again. Thick, steady, the kind that muffled footsteps and soaked into memory. Emily stood by the fireplace, staring at the collar she'd hung above it. The inscription still caught the light when the flames shifted. Property of Ruth. Hank lay on the rug nearby, breathing deep, his body finally at ease. She walked outside, boots crunching in the fresh powder. Across the ridge, the pine trees stood tall, cloaked in silence. But it wasn't the same silence as before. This one felt earned. She looked back at the cabin, smoke curling from the chimney, light glowing through the windows. This place had been her inheritance, not just the land or the mineral rights, but the truth, a woman's legacy, a dog's loyalty, and a promise that silence, no matter how long, would not erase the truth. She turned to Hank, who had followed her out and was now sitting in the snow, watching her. "We did it," she said softly. He blinked once, tail tapping the snow. It wasn't over. There would be hearings, audits, headlines. But the mountain had spoken. Ruth had been heard. And Hank had been her witness. Emily crouched down beside him, buried her fingers in his thick fur, and whispered, "She trusted you with everything. And you kept it safe." Hank leaned into her touch, eyes half-lidded, content. $3 million might change her life, but it would never change what mattered most. Truth, loyalty, and the dog who never gave up. The cabin didn't rise overnight. It took months of lumber deliveries, of sweat, of splinters, of waking up with sore arms and aching joints. But by spring, the rot was gone, the sagging beams replaced, the chimney restacked with fresh stone. The roof no longer leaked, and the porch didn't groan underfoot. What stood now wasn't just a rebuilt home, it was a statement, a restoration, a resurrection. Emily painted the door forest green, Ruth's color according to an old note she'd found tucked inside a ledger. Hank's collar stayed on the mantel, but now it shared space with framed photos. Ruth smiling beside a rock face, Jonas in his workshop, Hank sitting with 3 kids from town who'd visited the week before. Because people were coming now. At first it was just Clara and Alan, dropping off food and asking about updates on the mine audit. Then came Bert, bringing a rusted bench and a story about how he and Ruth used to sit beneath the old pine on the north slope. Emily placed the bench there, facing east, where the sun broke through the trees first thing in the morning. Hank lay beside it almost every day. By summer, the idea had grown into something bigger. Emily filed papers to reclassify the land part homestead, part sanctuary. She partnered with a local vet clinic and quietly opened what she called Ruth's Ridge, a modest but sturdy shelter for abandoned senior dogs and aging folks who had nowhere else to go. No publicity, no signs on highways, just word of mouth, and it spread. By the end of the first month, she had 3 dogs, 2 retired widowers, and a woman named Nadine who brought her own rocking chair and spent mornings knitting on the porch. They all loved Hank. Kids from town started showing up on weekends, riding bikes up the gravel road, carrying treats and homemade toys. Hank, once the silent sentinel of the ridge, now trotted beside them like a shaggy guardian of childhood. He never barked. He didn't need to. His presence carried weight now, a legend wrapped in fur. Emily watched it all unfold with a kind of quiet awe. She had spent years moving through the world like a shadow, never quite seen, never quite wanted. But here, under Ruth's trees and sky, with sawdust still caught in her hair and dirt beneath her nails, she felt grounded. Real. She would sometimes sit on the bench by the tree, journal in hand, Hank lying beside her, and listen to the breeze whistle through the pine needles. One afternoon, Jonas joined her, carrying 2 mugs of coffee and a newspaper folded under his arm. "State just froze Weston's accounts," he said, handing her a mug. "Audit found more than a few missing pages in his reports." There's talk of indictments. Emily took the cup, let the heat settle into her fingers. Ruth would have wanted that. She'd be proud of what you've built. She did most of it. I just followed the maps, Jonas chuckled, and rebuilt the whole damn mountain in the process. She smiled, then looked down at Hank, who was dozing in the grass. "He waited all those years?" she said. "And now?" "I think he's finally letting go." Jonas nodded. "Or maybe just passing the watch to someone else." They sat in companionable silence, listening to the far-off laughter of children playing with dogs near the creek. That evening, after everyone had gone to bed and the lanterns flickered out, Emily stood alone beneath the stars. The mountain was quiet, but not silent. She could hear owls in the distance, the wind rustling through leaves, the faint creak of the bench by the tree as it settled into the earth. Inside the cabin, Hank had already curled into his corner, paws twitching in sleep. Emily pulled the collar from the mantel, ran her thumb over Ruth's name, then placed it gently on a new hook beside the door eye level, like a sentinel's badge. No longer a memory. Now a legacy. Outside, the ridge stood strong and still, the trees whispering secrets only the faithful would ever understand. And in the middle of it all, the dog who never left had finally found home. Autumn returned to Ruth's ridge in a blaze of amber and gold. The trees stood tall and hushed, as if in reverence, their branches brushing against each other like old friends sharing secrets. The mornings brought fog that clung low to the grass, and the evenings wrapped the hills in lavender light. The cabin was no longer a place of silence. Laughter lived here now, the kind that came from children helping old dogs climb stairs, the kind shared over coffee mugs on the porch, boots kicked off, hearts laid open. But on this morning, the ridge was still. Hank lay beneath the great oak near the porch, the one Ruth had planted long ago with her own hands. Sunlight spilled through the branches, dappling his thick fur. His breathing was slow, steady. Emily sat beside him on a small wooden bench they'd placed just weeks earlier. The plaque had gone in the day before. It was small, no bigger than a book. Polished walnut, hand-carved, mounted at the base of the tree. He didn't bark for glory. He barked to protect the truth. She reached down, ran her hand along Hank's back. He didn't stir, but she felt the warmth beneath her palm, felt the heart that had carried 7 winters and just as many truths. She wasn't sure if he was sleeping or simply existing now, somewhere between the trees and the stories they held. Emily leaned back, eyes half closed, listening to the breeze as it whispered through the leaves. "It's funny," she said softly, voice barely more than a breath. "You never made a sound, and yet you told me everything I needed to know." She paused, smiling gently. "People think legacy comes from loud moments, speeches, big actions. But you showed me it's what we guard in silence that means the most." A few feet away, a young boy named Evan called to one of the rescue dogs from the porch, his voice bouncing off the trees. Hank's ears twitched once. Emily looked out across the property. The cabin stood proud now, its walls full of warmth, its roof firm. The kennels out back housed 7 senior dogs, each with their own story. Jonas came by twice a week to help with repairs. Clara ran the small garden near the creek. Alan had started baking bread in the old smokehouse, and people kept showing up, donating time, dropping off blankets, leaving notes. Not for her, for him. Because somehow, the legend of the dog who waited, who protected a truth no one else could see, had spread beyond the ridge. There were rumors now of a loyal German shepherd who led a woman to the remains of her long-lost aunt, who exposed a corrupt mayor, who stood guard over the last honest corner of a crooked mountain. Emily never corrected the stories. They didn't need embellishment. She stood, brushing off her jeans, and looked down at Hank. "If this is your last autumn," she said gently, "you earned every leaf." He opened his eyes, just for a moment. Met hers. That was enough. She walked back to the porch, where Evan waited with a cup of cider and questions about the mining maps he'd found in the shed. She answered him patiently. pausing only once to glance back at the oak. The plaque caught the sunlight, just long enough to glint like a wink from someone long gone. That evening, as stars blinked to life above the ridge, Emily recorded her thoughts for a local podcast covering forgotten American stories. Before she ended, she added, "Ruth's Ridge stands because of a dog who never stopped believing the truth mattered. His loyalty cracked open a silence buried deeper than gold. And now, every soul who finds shelter here can thank a dog who didn't bark for glory, but barked to protect the truth." She leaned toward the mic and spoke one last line, quiet but clear. "What's your story with a loyal pet?" Then she smiled. "And if this story moved you, if you believe in what a dog like Hank stood for, follow and support our Channel German Shepherd stories. Because the truth they protect deserves to be heard fade to black." Then a quiet bark. One, soft and certain, like an echo from the ridge,